Okay, well, once again, for those that have been quietly sitting there, welcome to our webinar today, which we are doing for the Data Protection Network. We thought at one of our board meetings a little while back that this would be a good topic, and I'm talking about probably 2 or 3 months ago, and it couldn't be more timely that we are doing it in light of the ICO's report into real-time bidding and a whole range of other things happening out there. So we are thrilled that we have got some excellent speakers with us on the panel, of whom 3 are in the room with me, and Townsend Feehan is dialing in from her office in Brussels. And so admin first, before we get into today. This is a recorded webinar. It will be available from our website and also from Opt4's website next week. We normally do a 1-hour webinar, as many of you know, but on this occasion, because of having 4 panelists, we thought we would extend it to 1.5 hours. But I know people are busy, and if we don't need to use the time, then we won't. But we have had, from those of you who registered, a whole host of really good questions. And so what we thought we would do today is to work our way through your questions, do as many as we can in the allotted time, and hopefully provide some thought. I'm not going to use the word answers, he says, looking at his fellow panelists, but we will do our best. And please, if you have other questions, use the question box and send them in, and if we can, we will take those as they come in, either then because they're appropriate or towards the end of the webinar. So just to introduce everyone, I think many of you know myself, so I'm not going to dwell on that, but if I can then turn to Julia. Julia is a senior associate with Opt4. She has got years of experience in this field, having been at Guardian News and Media, Getty Images, ITV, IPC magazines, and has obviously had a significant role, but as many of our other panelists have, with the Direct Marketing Association. And you can see that she's actively involved as a non-exec in a number of other worthy organizations. And then moving on to Phil Smith. Phil is Director General of ISBA, the voice of British advertisers, and has a lot of experience, both having been in-house at Kraft as Vice President, Strategy for Western Europe, was Marketing and Trading Director for Quick Saves, been with Camelot, a wealth of experience, and I was interested that Commercial Director for the 1,000 boat Thames Diamond Jubilee pageant in 2012, which many of us will remember. And then Tim Gentry, founder of TGC Limited, again, extensive experience in media, like Julia at one time at The Guardian, and is now providing consultancy through Hare and Tortoise Media Consulting, and another expert. And finally, on the phone is Townsend Feehan, who's CEO of IAB Europe. Prior to joining IAB Europe, Townsend was with Microsoft in Brussels, ran EU industry associations in the ICT, consumer electronics and biotechnology sectors. We couldn't have a better group of individuals to tackle this thorny issue of the challenging compliance landscape for Adtech. And it's not getting any easier. Probably as we are talking now, there's something else out there that we should be knowing about. But turning to the first question, and I suspect we will take some time on this, Most of you, if not all of you, I suspect, will have seen the ICO's latest report on Adtech and real-time bidding, RTB. How helpful is it? And I'm going to start in the room with Julia. Julia.
So I think it's very helpful, actually. I think some people will feel the ICO aren't going fast enough, and some people think that they're going too fast. But ultimately, what they've produced is an update, and I think update is a key word here because it's going to be the beginning of a thoughtful and iterative process to tackling multiple and complex issues. We should, I think, congratulate them for consulting quite widely. We had the conference in March. And actually, they have taken what I perceive to be quite a business-friendly view to considering these issues. Fundamentally, though, this is a shot across the bows. And I think businesses across all elements of the programmatic food chain need to pay attention. And I think there needs to be change. We've got a 6-month window now to have a bit of a think about it, and everyone is going to have to think about how the world is going to change.
And what do we think from ISBA's point of view?
I'd say,
or yours?
No, I think we would agree with all of that. It's clear and consistent with their direction of travel, and you could see it coming if you read the Brave complaint. I think the way in which they've shown an understanding of the competitive pressures and particularly the strength of some parties in the market and the way in which they've been prepared to engage along the way is to be commended. But as you say, it's a very clear shot across the bows, and I think it has big implications for everybody in the supply chain and for advertisers as well, because I think advertisers have a big role to play in driving some of this change. I mean, I think they need to look very hard at some of their own practices around data capture, around the contracts that they have both with smaller suppliers but also with their agencies as well, and how their agencies are enforcing the right behaviour through the chain. And the time frame that we've been given is pretty clear. So I think we will certainly see some action, and some of these points are going to get tested through fines and through appeals.
Okay. And
so my view is, I think, sort of trying to reflect here what I'm hearing in the market, particularly from independent technology businesses. That in one way, it is incredibly helpful. It's very helpful to have that shot across the bows and window of opportunity to work on the issues, and it's very helpful that the ICO has made quite clear really their direction of travel and what they think. And it is helpful, I'd agree, that they are thinking deeply about it and recognise that the issues are complex and that there are significant implications to steps taken to resolve. However, I think what's less helpful, or maybe less helpful in the views of independent technology businesses and potentially media owners as well, is that significant change to existing practice will be required as a result of the direction of travel that the ICO is taking. And of course, everyone finds that difficult. I think that's really interesting in context of where we are in the journey, sort of 15 years in to digital marketing in its truest forms. It seems that we're just entering, we've been 15 years of disruption, and now we're entering a new wave of disruption. And I think the ICO's report just signals the regulatory role that will play in accelerating that disruption and change through the industry.
Okay, and Townsend, on the line, what are your thoughts?
Yes, well, I think I would probably agree with a lot of what has been said. I think perhaps surprisingly, I would say that it's not unhelpful, and a helpful thing that it does is to focus, to provide the industry some very clear things to focus on during a defined period of time. And I think it's also helpful that what it appears to be asking for is actually just legal compliance, just real legal compliance. So the changes that need to be made that are called out are changes that would deliver compliance with the GDPR. One is not being hit with a completely different or new or alternative standard. There's a little bit in the paper that is uses, of course, the ICO's own interpretation of the GDPR with respect to whether legitimate interest legal basis should be available for, in different scenarios. But I think that the good message is that what the industry needs to do is just, quote unquote, to comply with the law. And that is a message that is important for my organization to hear right now, because we are trying very hard to get a GDPR compliant standard out into the market, specifically for digital advertising, specifically to cover processing of data in connection with digital advertising. So I think that we actually have, we are deeply invested in a program that that is very relevant and has big potential to address a lot of the issues called out in the report. I think that maybe the last observation is that it is actually such a complex topic that even an organization as sophisticated as the ICO and can make some small misconstructions in a paper like this, and even after the consulting. So, for example, the suggestion that our transparency and consent framework caters to for the processing of categories, special categories of data, categories of sensitive data, is not quite right. But so that it's again, it just proves the real complexity that's been evoked by some of my colleagues.
And on that point, I'm assuming that you're continuing the dialogue with the ICO and other regulators in order to try and get some of these misconceptions corrected.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say again that the misconceptions aren't the point. I mean, the point is definitely to get the industry to the point where there is 100% legal compliance. So the disturbing or alarming conduct that's called out in the report is all GDPR non-compliant behavior, and that's what we need to ensure is purged from the marketplace. So I think that's the main. I think for us, our main hope and expectation out of this 6-month period would be that we are able to even, perhaps it sounds presumptuous, but collaborate with the ICO to move the move the industry in the direction of the compliance that they are seeking, and for which I think we have a very relevant solution or standard.
Okay, thank you. And as you can see, one of the other questions that we had in was why was the focus so much on real-time bidding in the report?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a wonderful question, because I mean, why is the focus on RCB? The ICO could quite honestly have started absolutely anywhere, because levels of data sharing, especially depth of profiling and targeting on walled gardens, particularly in social media, could definitely be argued to exceed what happens within RTB, but even if then the consent mechanisms there are somewhat simpler, because the T's and C's that no one reads but happily signs up to. So I think it is interesting to think, why did the ICO start with RTB, and perhaps that's because an auction mechanic does drive higher levels of data sharing, because the auction mechanic is what requires many companies to value a particular impression, or and that's the driver of the high levels of data sharing which the ICO is interested in. I think the other part is that that the technology companies involved with RTB typically have no direct relationship with the user whatsoever, and that makes the consent framework particularly challenging, and And I suppose a lot of the issues that the ICO calls out around reliance on contractual arrangements, etc., are in a large extent just inherent in the way that the market works.
Yeah.
Okay, and Julia, you wanted to jump in?
Well, yes, so I agree with Tim, but I think there's a couple of other factors. I think, first of all, the mechanism, the auction mechanism means that a huge amount of data is made available to people who are bidding for programmatic, and so therefore there's huge scope for data breaches, whether there are or not, and I think that's an issue. And there's lack of accountability, so it's all based on contracts at the moment, and so therefore there's a fear that actually all this data's out there and they don't know what's going on. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is just your point about social media, is that inherently in that relationship is a consent, and that someone is signed up with Facebook, and so therefore they share their data, and I think that makes it quite tricky. The other factor is that actually somebody has complained, and I think the ICO to a very large extent are sort of forced to respond to complaints they receive, and they often say that. So they had some very vocal complainers, which they needed to respond to. And then my final point is that we shouldn't be mistaken in thinking that this is a discrete piece of work and this is all they're going to look at. What they're going to look at is all sorts of other aspects, but my impression is that they realised they had to start somewhere. So if you read their narrative at the beginning, it's very much, we have confined the scope to this area because we needed to start somewhere. They had to go on an education process, understand what the landscape looked like, and try to get a coherent conversation going. So this is the beginning. This is literally the beginning.
And I think it's really important that it is.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. No, I totally agree. I mean, it's the scale of the processing, the fact they've received a complaint, and there are parallel investigations going on in other parts of Europe as well. So particularly in Ireland to that same issue. And I think the other thing to say is it isn't the only thing they're doing. So we've just responded to age-appropriate design. So I think it is part of a pattern and a much larger examination that they're going to be biting off chunk by chunk.
And I'll ask this to you, Phil, but as you can see, one of the other questions we've got there is 6 months. I mean, that is not a long time.
No.
So the question is, what should businesses be doing now?
Well, I think from the point of view of advertisers, we've said before, we think that they're going to need to drive quite a lot of this change. I think they're going to have to look very hard at their relationships with third parties, including their agencies. I think they're going to have to examine the question of their own impact assessments, because that's clearly been called out, and there's some German precedent there that they need to be looking hard at as well. And then I think they need to be having some hard conversations with both their tech intermediaries, but also publishers themselves.
Yep.
Yeah, just on that point, I think what this serves to highlight, and in fact, for anyone who went to the ICO conference in March, what was interesting is there weren't a lot of tech companies there, and there weren't a lot of clients there, and there weren't a lot of media agencies there. There were a lot of media owners and activists and all these other people. And so actually the clients, the agencies and the tech companies need to start paying attention to this. And I think the industry as a whole, particularly from the marketing team's perspective, need to kind of go on a bit of an education process, because I'm not sure many people really understand how the mechanics of the market work and therefore what the risks are.
Yeah, I think that's right. And sometimes you'll have one set of answers from the marketeers who are a long way away from it, and a different set of answers from the legal team or the DP team. And they need to get much more shoulder to shoulder and have an understanding where they're trying to take this. So at the end of the day, this is about a long-term relationship with the public.
Yes.
And although in the big piece of trust work that we did with the Advertising Association last year, this wasn't top of the list of the public's concerns. Trust is in long-term, almost terminal decline. We're trusted as advertisers less than politicians. Which says something. Although bombardment is top of the list and vulnerable people come second, we know that when people are probed about the industry's use of personal data, they're disturbed.
Yeah. So I'm just going to ask this to Townsend. Anything that you want to add to what we've just been discussing there from your perspective?
Maybe just really briefly, without repeating myself too much. I think we do have, we have an industry standard that that more of the market should be looking at, that enables those third parties that are behind the website, the technology partners, companies doing measurement and that don't have that direct interface with the user. So our solution enables the website, whether the website is doing ad personalization or content personalization, to obtain a legal basis for data processing on behalf of the technology partners, as those third parties behind the website. And in a way, so we've had version 1 of the standard out in the market for a year, and version 2.0 is going to go. We're going to have an implementation version out in the course of this summer. It has some significant improvements in comparison with version 1, significant extensions, and that is just a very concrete, practical way that the ad-supported internet can go about addressing the transparency and legal basis issues that are called out in the ICO report.
Okay, and while I've got you, Townsend, I'm just jumping down to one of the other questions. In your experience, how connected or how aligned is the ICO with the thinking of the other regulators in Europe? And are we going to expect other regulators to be coming out with something similar or parallel to the ICO's views on the Adtech?
Yeah, so I think that's hard to say. I think there is a lot of interest. Well, it's self-evident. There's a fair amount of interest amongst a number of DPAs in Adtech. I think there's even a little bit of competition to get out and be seen to be doing something in the Adtech space. It's a fascinating space. It has fascinating and profound societal issues in it, and it's fun for that reason from the regulator's point of view, and it's really immediate and palpable for the citizenry. So we seem to see a clutch of DPAs that are interested in doing something on Adtech. I have so I don't have that.
We lost it.
Lost Townsend.
Yes, we have lost Townsend. Hopefully we'll be back with us in a minute, but I was just actually going to turn to Tim, because while we've been speaking, we've had a question come in, and Phil was talking about this being a matter of trust and it's a business issue, but this person, I imagine, who's a data protection officer, has said getting the DPO involved is crucial if privacy compliance is to be encouraged. In your experience, are DPOs kept up to date with organizational changes, bearing in mind the need to understand processes, products, projects, etc., in order to assess risk? So, Tim, thoughts?
I think this is fascinating because it's typically such a fast-moving area. There is a new business, certainly over the last 5-10 years, there will have been a new business, a new offering in the space, almost moment by moment. And I think it would be fair to say that even the experts who focus on programmatic within either an agency or an advertiser or media owner would struggle to keep up with the pace of change. And so knowing when it's appropriate and when not to consult with colleagues on this probably is quite a big cultural challenge. But I think the questioner has a very good point, though, that the moment any significant changes are being discussed, then it's absolutely vital that every part of an organisation collaborates with one another.
Yeah, every part.
And I think that's I think that really talks to the need for, I suppose, broader cultural change that that digital transformation requires.
Yeah, and I mean we're seeing massive increases of complexity in the organisations that we deal with as they cope with their own internal transformations. Their relationships with their external partners are becoming more complex rather than more simple. So moving away from the one-stop shop of the big agency group to relationships where they own more of their data, own more of their tech, use more specialists. It's becoming more and more siloed and more difficult. And one of the challenges we face very often is linking up functions like procurement with marketing,
Yeah.
with media, and then you'd have to start thinking about legal and data protection officers as well. So and some of our members are much better at that than others.
Yeah, and I think what we have here within both of these environments is a need for almost reinventing the way that organisations are working with one another and their partners that answers their requirements of today and tomorrow, rather than building on historical structures. Because I think a lot of the debate over the last 3-4 years around Adtech and perhaps the advertising industry more generally has sort of been perhaps a little hair shirt wearing about where we have ended up after 10-15 years of disruption, and pointing the finger at, oh, it's their fault, and really perhaps it's no one's fault. It's just the fact that we've had a huge amount of change in a very fast moving industry, and now we need to sort of almost find ways of simplifying for success, to declutter organisational structures to help get the right people involved at the right time.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. I think the question makes an extremely fair point, in that I think they really struggle often to get involved in the organisations. I think what's been interesting through the general GDPR process, I think my experience with clients, is that it exposes how siloed organisations are. And certainly Tim and I used to work together at The Guardian, and we definitely were doing very different things at different times and didn't know what the other was doing. So I think silos is a massive issue. But also I think agencies in particular, in some instances, have done their clients a disservice, because, I mean, funny enough, I did a training program around programmatic, and so I went and learned it for myself. And what was interesting is there was a certain amount of education, but in the end, I think the media agencies would be well advised to help their clients understand it better, because in the end, the people who've got the budgets are the clients, and the people who can decide whether to spend the money or not are the clients. And we just need them to kind of have a better understanding of how it works at a broad level. It doesn't have to be granular, but strategically you need to have some concept of what this new world, because programmatic's not going to go away. That's the whole point. How we use it may change, but programmatic itself is not going to go away.
And I think one of the things that we work on quite a lot is creating better alignment of commercial interests between agencies and clients, because I think that's one of the lines that has got somewhat fractured as change has happened. And some of the things that have needed to be uncovered and addressed have not been uncovered and addressed because it's not been in people's interests to do so. And the old simple world of I make a TV ad and you spend more on TV, the more your business grows, isn't the way that the relationship now currently works between agencies and clients, and that we need to calibrate that differently.
And I agree. And just on that point is the other thing that I think is quite striking, and the ICO sort of alludes to it in the paper, is the difficulties around establishing an ROI around this activity. It's like, if you do this activity, what return on investment do you get? How much money do you actually make? Do you actually need all this data in order to increase your sales? And that feels like that needs a bit of work in terms of being able to sort of establish, I spend this much money with these audiences against these targets, then I get this kind of return on investment.
So another question came in, and I'm going to give it to Phil, because the person that sent it said you were talking about the advertisers need to think about what changes they need to make, etc. But the question is, where does that, and what should the publishers be doing?
So it's a very good question. I think the publishers need to be looking hard in the mirror too. I mean, I recognise that there are huge commercial pressures on many of the publishers today, and it's not just in the field of data where we see things where the public is not being well served. So if I take one particular very popular daily, you will see 250 ads on a page, a monster page. So ad loads are a major issue. You'll see the advertising context is appalling. So you'll see ads for reputable brands appearing for ads right side by side with ads for the same category from what to all intents and purposes could be Chinese knockoff brands, because you have no idea where they've come from. There's no address on the website. And then you have a lot of the stuff that gets through the content display networks, which at best is pretty poor advertising context, which at worst is outright scam. So you see last year what £27 million was lost to Bitcoin scams, you can see that in the same field of view as major reputable brands against publishers' sites. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done for publishers to get their house in order. And I do think they need to come back to the relationship they have both with their readers, but also with their advertisers as the major source of funds.
Although I think publishers, particularly premium publishers, have. You think of the journeys that publishers, I think the Telegraph is really interesting in its journey to a subscription model. I think a lot of the work around in magazine publishing, like Condé Nast, etc., where they've diversified revenue streams and got into events and consulting.
I think I should qualify what it's the ones who are very heavily ad funded.
Yes.
The ones who are exclusively ad funded are the ones who probably have most to do.
Yeah. And that is because, as you say, the publishers ad funded business models are significantly challenged, and significantly challenged predominantly because of the enormous market share taken by the large technology platforms. And I think one of the really fascinating questions in the broader context of this discussion is how the ICO and other regulatory bodies, I'm thinking of the discussion in the States as well, start to move at the same time across the whole landscape, so that there are not decisions made in one part of the industry which have really significant and undesirable unintended consequences on what is still, I guess, a pillar of our society in free and open journalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made a good point here, because we're talking about real-time bidding right now. So real-time bidding represents approximately 25% of the total programmatic pot, but also you've got people like Google or Facebook or the very large social networks who are really hoovering up most of the ad budgets. So that's kind of one issue. And the other issue, I think, is that the media owners probably could do with collaborating a bit more around setting standards, and because I think the media owner I think you're referring to probably just thinks we just need to get the money in, because that really is the only place they get their revenues from. So they've got to think about their own business model, but also thinking about what kind of standards they want to set. And I think at the moment all of the media owners are sitting there thinking, well, I'm not going to jump first. I think there's a little bit of who's going to make a move first in terms of changing the way in which they operate.
We've been engaged in active discussions around some of that standard setting, as much around content verification and the topic of brand safety and suitability as anything else. But I think there's a recognition that there needs to be a setting of a higher bar.
And so within the context of this discussion around compliance, however, then I think it is especially difficult for the media owners, because they are the shop window for the users to be accessed, and so all of the consent mechanisms and frameworks will either fall at the door of the media owner or at the door of the advertiser. All the intermediaries in between have no relationship whatsoever, and hence that's why I think it is incumbent on both media owners and advertisers to try and find their ways through the consent frameworks.
So I want to slightly change tack here, partly because of some of the other questions that are coming in, which are really good questions, which we'll get to in a minute. But looking at some of those questions you sent in earlier, there's a couple that are around cookies. And obviously that ICO report, amongst other things, talked about the consumer's inability to comprehend or understand what was being done with their data. So do you think that we are going to end up having to be even more transparent and clever and compliant with the way that we display cookie pop-ups, information, really get the permission from the individual to do what they're doing? And allied to this, I don't know whether you've seen it, but recently apparently there was a case in Austria where an individual complained to the Austrian regulator about the fact that the consent for cookies being set or otherwise was not meaningful. And it's interesting that they've said, no, this is perfectly acceptable because the website offered the opportunity for you to continue to get the benefit of it without cookies being set. And I think we've not necessarily been as clever and as clear as we should be. What do you think?
I mean, I think this question really drives to the heart of the issue, which is, are we building a regulatory environment for the future based on our previous ways of doing things, which were absolutely right when data-driven marketing was all about direct mail or even email. Consent was a very clear and straightforward basis on which to see if users were comfortable. As we get into areas where, and I think it's really important to just reinforce that we are only at the beginning in terms of the evolution of how data is used within marketing. If you think voice recognition, this huge amount of data being captured and could be used in ad targeting in terms of voice devices, facial recognition, huge amounts of data being there. And we have already talked about the fact that we're into issues which even the experts find difficult to keep up with in their complexity. So I think it does beg the question, is it right to rely on consent as the mechanism? Or should really regulations start to go further into thinking about, well, what is right and proper use of data and what's a new framework for it? And I think Brian O'Kelly at the recent Senate hearing was really interesting, talking about a new data bill of rights in the US based on that.
I think regulation has to go further. You're moving much closer to really big social responsibility and ethical questions when you see what marketing can do, even with the data and the metadata that's being produced now. So until we work out what is the right line in a civilized society, I think we're going to be scrabbling around in the foothills.
So I agree. I mean, I think, well, I agree and disagree in that regulation will go further. It will have to go further, but we cannot rely on regulation alone, because actually the technology will always outpace the regulation, and they'll always think of ways of breaking the rules. The fact of the matter is, right now, the ICO did a piece of research when they did their investigations, when they used Harris Research, they published on their website somewhere, which basically said when they fully explained to people what was happening to their cookies, then they didn't understand, and actually their deciding whether to consent or not was massively diminished. The thing that surprises me, and I've seen a few good examples of it, is that the selling or explaining of the consent for cookies has sort of been left with, often been left, I'm going to say, with the legal department or with the data protection officer or whatever it is. And in fact, I see this as a branding exercise as much as anything else. It's explaining in an interesting way to people who are not going to read long screeds of text why they should get involved with sharing their cookies, and explicitly explaining what's in it for them. It should be explaining to customers why it's worth their while, rather than explaining why it's the technology's while. Because in fact, there is a value exchange that customers will happily participate in. So if you ask a customer, will you share your data? It's like, well, what's in it for me? And if you can explain that and allow people to control it, then in fact there's a great opportunity.
I think it does come down to value exchange, and I think you can point to some very good examples where the value exchange is a simple and straightforward one between two parties. I think where it's much more difficult to do is when the benefit you receive in return for sharing all of this data, which by the way is loads, and you're sharing with loads of parties, is you get better targeted ads. Well, I think the general response from people I've talked to is, well, that's not a great reward. I mean, I know the alternative isn't very good either, but the value exchange I think does seem disproportionate.
And Townsend, are you on the line?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm back. I mean, I think actually this is one of the most fascinating issues right now. What is the future of informed consent? Is informed consent a contradiction in terms? Transparency and control is like the core proposition of the GDPR. So in 2012, it's not that long ago. It's only been enforced for a year now, a little over a year. But the central proposition is, if users have enough information and can make choices, on the one hand, then processing of personal data, including for digital advertising, should be able to take place on the other. And we've only, GDPR has only been enforced for a year. If we can't make that, if we can't deliver on that proposition, if we ultimately find that we don't, there's no such thing as informed consent, that users are actually just incapable of taking decisions that are the right decisions for them, and need to have the choices taken out of their hands, that it's a completely different paradigm. And relating it to the value exchange, I don't know what would ensue. I think the ad supported business model is not the only business model, and media don't need possibly a combination of advertising and subscription and conferences and everything else. But I think that this core proposition of the user being given the responsibility and freedom to choose on what terms he or she accesses information, education, technology, online services, which ones you pay for and which ones you don't pay for with money, but you allow an advertiser to use data that you are in complete control of and have full transparency about. I think we just have to be very careful before we jettison that paradigm, because I can't imagine that what would follow it would actually be as much in users' interest as the prospect of making this paradigm work should be.
Thank you for that. And I'm actually just going to read out a couple of the questions that have come in, because they're all in this little ecosystem we're talking about. The one is, how are we managing consent? Why are we not doing more with legitimate interest as a lawful ground for processing? And the other one is how are we supposed to know when a marketing message is a marketing message or a service message when we don't actually have a legal definition of marketing? We certainly don't under the Data Protection Act 2018 in the UK. So hasn't industry got a problem in that it's being asked to try and meet something that is not properly defined, I think is the question here. So there's two things wrapped in, and I know somebody's asking this because of the recent EE decision over what's a service message as opposed to a marketing communication. I'd be interested in the thoughts on that. And then it sort of segues into questions that a number of people sent in when registering, which is how do you find the right lawful ground here when we've already been talking about consent being either meaningless or not appropriate, etc. So, Julia?
Yeah.
None of those are particularly straightforward, are they?
Steps back pretty swiftly.
So
I guess the thing about legitimate interest is quite interesting, and in fact the ICO talk about this at some length. So the Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulation says that you need consent to drop cookies. So that's pretty clear. And then you've got the debate about segmenting and processing that data into segments, and then I think it gets into a world of quite complicated issues. So there is the issue around whether the people who are creating segments are data controllers or data processors. So actually, if you collect data, so let's imagine the Guardian collects some data and then passes it down the line to all of these different Adtech companies, then are they data processors or are they data controllers? And actually, the Guardian should potentially be saying, we collect data for all these other people to use. And then if they are able to say that in advance, then actually, potentially it's okay. Now, the problem is that you can't say in advance who's going to receive all that data. So that's an issue to start with. And then there's this whole notion around, doing a legitimate interest assessment. So, is the collection of data reasonable, fair? Does it sort of invade your privacy? There's all these questions. So actually, you would expect any of these companies to have done a data protection impact assessment. And in fact, what the ICO have said is they see not much evidence of that. And I think data protection impact assessments could become, the flavour of the month in the next year, 6 months. Imagine there'll be lots of data protection impact assessments happening. And then the second thing is that if they do decide to use legitimate interest, then you'd expect to see a legitimate interest assessment, which is going through those 3 stages of what's the purpose of collecting the data, what's the necessity, and what's the balancing test. So the ICO got very helpful. Now again, I doubt very few people have done that either. But in fact, one of the interesting things that they talk about in the balancing test is what's the nature of the data and what's your reasonable expectations and what's the likely impact. Now, if you're collecting sensitive information and then using that in order to profile, then the answer is you probably don't have a legitimate interest, because actually there isn't enough transparency around what's happening to the data. And so I think this is why legitimate interest is a challenge. I agree with the ICO on this. It's challenging to imagine when you could really use legitimate interest.
Yeah, I agree. I think they shut the door pretty firmly in the face of legitimate interest in the update.
Yeah, and in fact, if you read the guidance, then you kind of see why. So I think that's the challenge. And then on the other point about the marketing messages, I think it's really tricky. I've just worked with a client where we have literally gone through every single communication and gone marketing message, service message, is it, isn't it, is it, isn't it? I mean, very big companies got fined for making mistakes on this one. Like the Royal Mail famously got fined and very embarrassed about it because they accidentally put some promotional information into an email. Not fined a lot because it was a genuine mistake. And yeah, you're right, there is no kind of definition. I mean, one of the things I say to clients is like, if it's got anything about prices, money, or transactions or anything like that, it's a marketing message. But I mean, everyone has to make up their own set of rules, don't they?
Yeah, and Townsend, any thoughts?
Just that I think the standard for freely given consent in the GDPR is almost unachievable, and I think it'll be interesting to see whether that survives, the first review of the regulation. I think the qualifications of no detriment, if you suffer any detriment if you withhold your consent or withdraw it, then consent is not an appropriate legal basis. There can't be any asymmetry between the user and the provider of the online service. Otherwise, consent is not an available legal basis. There can't be any processing of data that's not necessary to deliver the service, or you don't have consent as an available legal basis. So I think it's fine to say that consent feels intuitively like a better legal basis for profiling, but I think that the consent legal basis, if the notion of freely given consent is strictly applied under the GDPR, consent just may not actually be available. That debate is taking place in the e-privacy, regulation discussions right now, and where the European Parliament ended up was basically, no user must be denied. Users cannot be denied access to the full richness of any given online service merely because they withhold consent for data processing, and that's not strictly necessary to deliver the service, so that's a pretty extreme position. We'll see. The council doesn't feel quite that extreme right now, but so I think the future of consent, from another angle, is also sort of in doubt, or the availability of it for a lot of the for some processing that my member companies do.
And sorry, Townsend. I was just fascinated by what you were saying there, because I think it really does bring out what the true value exchange is here, because the value exchange is not that the user shares data in exchange for more targeted advertising. It's the fact that the user shares data for content and experiences that are funded by that advertising. And so I do wholeheartedly agree with you that it's almost impossible to imagine a world where taking the source of that income away does not then have consequences on the services that can be provided.
Yeah, and we've had a comment in which I think is interesting, and that is that it isn't the problem with advertisers that they hold sensitive data, not because they've requested it, but it occurs in the nature of the profiling about an individual that you now end up with sensitive data after the event, so to speak, which again makes it problematic to then try and find consent.
Well, you don't need to keep it though, do you?
Good point.
Well, I mean, I guess that goes to the heart of the complaint that they're responding to, doesn't it? That a lot of this data is going out in lots of different directions and nobody knows where it's gone.
Yes.
I mean, I thought it was telling that Brian O'Kelly at the Senate hearing, who invented the first ever, arguably the first ever advertising exchange with Right Media Exchange, founder of AdNexus, and he was saying even with all of his expertise and experience and his absolute enormous intellect, would find it almost impossible to track what had happened to his data because it's given the complexity of the ecosystem as is.
But I guess one of the points that the Brave complaint makes, and I think it's something to consider, is that there is a suggestion actually if you remove certain fields, certain elements of the data, so they becomes anonymous, then in fact a lot of these problems go away. And so I think Johnny Ryan's point is that, I don't know, 14 data points or something can just be removed and then it's all anonymous, and so you still do all your targeting, but it's no longer personal data. And is that something we should consider doing? And because clients don't really know, I don't think, what data makes the difference, which one's going to make the difference to their bottom line, then it's quite hard to make that judgment about whether you can or cannot remove that data.
Yeah, and I think someone asked earlier, what do we all need to do in the next 6 months? And I think having first and foremost a clear understanding of what is happening today, and then secondly of what is happening today, then what's genuinely driving the difference to my business is the first and second most important steps to take, because then within the context of inevitable change, you can argue for the ones which are going to have the least impact on your business.
Yeah, and I think the ICO report actually was frustrated because they didn't feel like they were getting that kind of information back. It's like, well, why don't you know these things? Was sort of the feeling I got, because it's like, well, you need to find out and figure it out.
There are many who are sort of in the field of algorithm development and machine learning who would say that actually we will, as the amount of data getting processed continues to increase exponentially and the processing power continues to increase exponentially, then the machines will find out which are the very few data points which are necessary, and there will be a rationalization of the amount of data that is being collected, because it will naturally become apparent that it's not important about what the weather's doing and some of the smaller data points, but it is perhaps more important about those data points which have always been important, like postcodes.
But do you need personal data is the question, isn't it? Because postcodes is indeed personal data. Yeah. So do you need to know my device ID? Do you need to know my IP address? Those kind of things. Can you know all the other data and figure out what's going to be interesting to me because you know what my cookie is?
I think
personal data.
Yeah, Townsend.
If I could just jump in for 1 second. I think the hard thing, so that sounds nice. I think it's facile and doesn't really stand up to scrutiny, either technically or legally. I mean, my conviction is that the definition of personal data in the GDPR is broader than it was in the 9546 directive, and it's very hard. It's very hard. There's not much left that's not personal data under the GDPR. Direct, indirect, that could be including pseudonymous data that could be identify someone if other data from nobody knows where could be added to the mix, and so I think I think it sounds good, but I'm not sure it as I say, really stands up to scrutiny, and that there's merit in trying, as I said a few minutes ago, to make the law that we've just had on the books for a couple of years actually work, and to try and deliver on legally processing personal data in a way that complies with the new regulation.
Okay, and while I've got you, Townsend, one of the questions that came in is, if we're having to address the issues of the right to do things with people's data now in a post-GDPR world, do we really need the new e-privacy regulation around marketing consents and so on, or is it just adding another confusing layer?
I think that's a lovely question. I could have submitted that question myself. I would say we don't. I would say we really don't. And I mean, I think we don't need the cookie, the updated cookie provisions in the e-privacy regulation. I can't speak for confidentiality of communications and other aspects that are more telecom related. But I think we definitely, GDPR made the cookie part of the e-privacy legislation completely redundant. It's all to do with personal data, and I think we probably realistically only had that cookie provision. We only have the Article 8 because of more sort of probably EU institutional reasons than because there was any real gap in the law or in consumer protection.
Okay. Looking around the table, anybody want to add to that?
It's clear that it's been a struggle to make e-privacy and GDPR consistent, which I think tells a story in itself. I think the only other thing I'd say is it's not just what's coming down the pike in regulatory terms. Obviously, we're seeing competitive pressures are changing the cookie landscape as well. So what will and won't be prevalent in the market through browsers, I think, is in itself changing.
Yeah, and I think really when one thinks of the journey that addressable advertising is on overall, still very early, but absolutely happening in TV, happening also in out of home, with location-based marketing, and so I think I think I couldn't agree more with Townsend, because it's a classic example of perhaps where it's so challenging to develop the regulations at a pace that where they're adding value.
But I think just around the TV thing, as an interesting counterpoint, then I think as a consumer, you have a better idea of what's going on than you would if you're just browsing a website. So I think the education around, how you end up with that ad is generally somewhat lacking. So if you look at someone like, I don't know, Channel 4, for instance, and what they've done, or where Sky have progressed, is that, it is much, much clearer and obvious what it is you're getting and why you're getting that advertising. And I think it comes back to this value exchange. I mean, the fact of the matter is the Privacy Directive is not going to come for another 2 years or so, ever. Like, everyone's sort of worrying about the election right now. So I don't think it's anything, it's not going to be there anywhere. And I think probably people will quietly forget about it.
So there's quite a lengthy question that has come in from one of the attendees, but in a way it addresses the penultimate bullet point on this slide, which is ethics. And the question or the comment that's come in is very much around the fact we are moving to a new era, a new economic order, and this difficult triangle, I suppose, with business that needs data and government that wants data and consumers that now realize that their data has a value. So partly ethics and so on, but partly what do you think we should be doing in terms of trying to balance those competing elements? What should we be doing to actually explain to the consumer, if they actually wanted to know, what happens to your data, what are your rights, and perhaps set our own agenda. Because my worry is with things like the ICO's report, and we sort of touched on it earlier, if we are not setting the agenda, somebody will set it for us, and it may be the answer we don't want to hear. Phil?
Cool. Really
Loads
big.
of things.
No, it's a really big question, and clearly, if you think about the parallel in political advertising and the furore that, at least in our circles, has taken place, you have to say that the same questions should be applied in the commercial sphere as well. And whilst there's not evidence that electoral tampering has had impact, Elizabeth Denham's most recent one that I saw, this piece of evidence to the select committee that says, well, if it didn't happen now, they're working to make it happen in the future. I think it is germane. I mean, as you said, we are in the foothills of the use of data for marketing purposes. And in a sense, the advertising industry has been around this loop once before in the past, when the hidden persuaders came out and suddenly everybody started talking about rational advertising, rather than the subliminal, emotionally driven advertising. And I think that for many of us, the question is going to be, at what level of efficacy do we draw the line? I mean, at what point do we start to make our consumers, and I think even that term we're going to have to think about differently soon. Do we turn them into puppets because we're becoming so affected by the way in which we're manipulating them? And you can see in the way that digital technology now is creating habits and creating behavioural change. That there are some big questions that need to be asked. And I think those are being asked by advertisers, leading advertisers, as we speak now.
Yeah, and I think I mean, Phil, I'm sure you'll have things to add to this, but I think the broader business context for the advertiser is really interesting when you think about the importance of driving efficacy of advertising, because when you look at overall Western economies, low growth, not very low. I mean, we have a huge FMCG business I think in the same building as us here, and I'm sure that in their sector in particular, there will be overall very low growth in terms of consumption of the various different goods that they produce, and yet incredibly low barriers to entry. Anyone can now create a direct to consumer brand in anything from financial services to razors to car sharing. And so within that highly competitive environment that's very low growth, it's incredibly important that advertisers have a way of driving efficient communications in order to continue to grow their businesses. And I hope that's making sense to everyone in the room, because and on the call, because I think it's a fundamental point, really, that highly efficient targeted advertising is not only something which supports publisher businesses, but supports advertiser businesses too, and they are, after all, what supports our whole economy.
Yeah, I think there are some big questions that still are being asked about what forms of advertising we're creating and what form of demand it's generating. As you said, we're in a low growth environment. Before we even start talking about what climate pressures are going to have on the way in which we consume in the future, what we've seen is that some of these forms of very targeted advertising are very effective when it comes to conversion activity or responsive activity. For the kinds of brands that are looking to create long-term memories and brand affinity that drives long-term sales, there's much more of a question mark about whether that's the case. So I do think that some of the models of advertising that we're using within the technology that we have, which have been very focused on actually finding what's the cheapest way I can get to this set of eyeballs, when you actually boil it down, are going to be subject to some examination.
I think it's interesting. The Direct Data Marketing Association, DMA, did a piece of research which is called What Consumers Really Think, and the things that came out of that, one of which was that people have different views about data, so you need to kind of be, cognizant of the fact that there are some people who want to protect their data very carefully, and then there'll be other people who are completely unconcerned. But actually, the most important thing was that consumers largely believe that the balance of power is in favour of the company and not in favour of them. And so actually, the most important point is to kind of redress that balance so that the consumer feels like they're controlling their relationship with those companies. Because at the moment, I think 85% think the balance is far too far towards the company and not in their favour. And this comes back to this notion of control. Then my second point is that I think in the end, the ICO will have to start thinking about how does advertising harm people and which aspects of advertising causes harm. So the ASA spent a lot of time thinking about harm. And I think if you think about sensitive data and, you know, very, very sensitive personal data, then actually using that could cause an awful lot of harm. Whereas knowing what the weather is today, or the fact that I walked over Blackfriars Bridge or whatever it is, may cause no harm at all. And so I think you'll end up starting to segment different categories of data based on harm.
Yeah, and clearly the ICO has its head very much around the collection of data on young people, on children. You know, which you'd have to say in principle has to be something they need to look at. But how we tackle that, I think, is a really good question.
And Townsend, any comments on that, the ethics type issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much to say. I think there's a ton of there's a lot of thinking going on, and some, massive resources are being invested in thinking through issues around the use of AI, and I think it'll be interesting to see what the next commission comes up with by way of sort of data policy that's not focused on data protection and privacy per se, but data all up. I think, speaking now in a personal capacity, I think it is a little unnerving to reflect on the degree to which very banal household consumption data or consumer purchasing information about consumer purchasing habits actually can be probably used reasonably effectively as a proxy for your position in the society and maybe your political orientation or your likely receptivity to a certain political message, and I think that that has to be acknowledged, and maybe some of the rules about political communication in the broadcast and offline media will ultimately need to be imposed in the online world. But that's not a message I have any mandate to say from my membership. But I think they're really huge and critical issues.
Thank you. And we've, as you could see, these were the last three of the questions that we had in advance, and we pretty much talked about e-privacy and so on. We've had some good questions coming in from those of you, thank you, who are on the webinar, but I think we probably exhausted the topic for this session, and I'm sure that we will probably be doing this again before too long with a whole new series of challenges to consider in the Adtech space. But before I wind up, any final comments from you, Townsend?
No, it's been great fun, and to hear all the thoughts from the other panelists, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have IB Europe participate, and I'll be looking forward to listening to future webinars.
Thank you very much indeed. And any final comments around the table? Phil, Tim, Julian.
Just to say, probably the one that we're most focused on is that public trust in advertising. And as I say, it's not just data, but bombardment, frequency, volume, lack of relevance. Those are the things that people complain about, and there's a lot that the industry needs to do there.
Okay.
And just a thank you from me. Thank you for having me, and it's been a pleasure to participate.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the time to get going, isn't it? I mean, this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's going to be many more now. So if anyone thought that this was going to go away, I should think they need to think again now.
Yeah, thank you. And from me, on behalf of those of you on the call, thanks to our panelists. It's been great fun. I hope you've enjoyed it. For those of you who are here, thank you for your questions. As I said at the beginning, the recording will be available for download in a few days' time. And we very much look forward to being with you on another occasion for another DPN webinar. Thank you.
Thanks, Robert.